read parts of the text and then talk through. There's some longer material in the middle that I will just talk through, but I'll try to indicate when I'm reading and when I'm talking so that you know where I am. So the title of the paper is Kant, Natural Piety, and the Limits of Science. And I start with three quotations, one from Ludwig Wittgenstein, and one from an American poet, an American radical feminist poet of the 1950s and 60s named Muriel Rukeyser, and then finally one from Thomas Nagel, a recent book by Thomas Nagel. So I'll just read those because they're quite interesting. So Wittgenstein says, "The truly apocalyptic view of the world is that things do not repeat themselves. It isn't absurd, for example, to believe that the age of science and technology is the beginning of the end for humanity. That the idea of great progress is a delusion, along with the idea that the truth will ultimately be known. That there is nothing good or desirable about scientific knowledge, and that mankind, in seeking it, is falling into a trap. It is by no means obvious that this is not how things are." And then the quotation from the poem by Muriel Rukeyser. The poem is called The Speed of Darkness. Extremely interesting piece of work. But in any case, in one of the verses she says, "Time comes into it. Say it. Say it. The universe is made of stories, not of atoms." And then the quotation from Thomas Nagel, from his recent book Mind and Cosmos, is that rational intelligibility is at the root of the natural order. Okay, now I'm going to start with the introduction section. And I'm going to stick pretty close to the text here. It's of course fully recognized by Kantians and widely known even outside Kantian philosophy that Kant is a serious metaphilosophical critic of classical rationalist metaphysics, especially in the Critique of Pure Reason. Nevertheless, it is far less well known and sometimes even completely overlooked, even by Kantians and Kant scholars alike, not to mention non-Kantians, that Kant is also an equally serious metaphilosophical and also first-order philosophical critic of both scientific naturalism, which is the doctrine that everything in the world, including ourselves, is ultimately physical, and that, quote, "science is the measure of all things," unquote, and also natural mechanism, which is the doctrine that all natural processes are ultimately composed of purely physical, inert physical items operating according to strict natural laws and primitive recursive algorithms, especially in the critique of power of judgment. I think the main reason for this is that Kant scholars have tended and still tend to focus quite narrowly on the critical and pre-critical periods, that is, the periods prior to 1781, to the serious neglect of what I have called the proto-critical period, which is from 1768 to 1772, and also what I call the post-critical period, which is after 1787. And this talk in particular will focus on the post-critical Kant as opposed to the merely critical Kant. From 1781 through 1787, the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason was published, the A edition in 1781, and the B edition in 1787. In a recent essay, Directions in Space, Non-Conceptual Form, and the Foundations of Transcendental Idealism, I've offered reasons for taking the proto-critical very seriously, and I have also developed and defended Kant's critique of scientific naturalism in detail in this book I mentioned before, Kant, Science and Human Nature. Moreover, I have also argued in two other recent essays that I think that Kant's anti-mechanism is the most seriously overlooked and underexploited part of what I call Kant's real metaphysics in contemporary philosophy. And real metaphysics there is supposed to be in contrast to classical metaphysics, as Kant would have known it in his period, and also contemporary, what in North America and England particularly is known as analytic metaphysics. So I'm very interested in opposing a Kantian real metaphysics to contemporary analytic metaphysics. This overlooking and underexploiting is ironic because Kant's anti-mechanism had a heavy influence on post-German idealism up to and including Hegel. And although Kant's anti-mechanism has had a non-trivial impact in philosophical aesthetics and the philosophy of biology, an impact that in turn has been well covered and well studied in recent Kant scholarship in those areas, this has not been, ironically enough, worked out in its specifically metaphysical implications, but instead only either in its history of ideas influence or in its epistemological implications. But most ironically of all, Kant's anti-mechanism has had an exceptionally deep and wide impact outside professional academic philosophy, in literature and other fine arts, and in the environmental movement. So what I want to focus on particularly in this paper are, first, Kant's critique of natural mechanism in his post-critical period, specifically developed as a thesis in real metaphysics that I will call Kantian anti-mechanism, and second, developing Kantian anti-mechanism into a larger scope, contemporary radical philosophy of nature, including a radical philosophy of natural science that I call natural piety. And the term piety there, which is obviously drawn from religious texts and religious writings, is supposed to annoy contemporary philosophers of science. That's why I'm using it in particular, but it's also drawing on a long tradition going back to the early 19th century of talk about natural piety, and we'll talk a little later about what that means. Now, why do I say that the doctrine of natural piety is radical? For three reasons. It's radical, first, because it's explicitly and robustly metaphysical. It's committed to a view I call liberal naturalism, and it's not merely epistemology, not merely epistemological, not merely about knowledge. It's about the way the world is. Second, it is explicitly and robustly value-driven, committed to what I call the primacy of the normative, with serious aesthetic, ethical, natural religious, and even sociocultural political implications. And third, and this might surprise you given what I've already said, it's explicitly and robustly pro-science, but without being at the same time scientistic, where scientism is scientific naturalism, this physicalist view that also thinks that science is, the way the world is, plus the dogmatic epistemic thesis that all methods of inquiry and knowledge are ultimately reducible to natural scientific methods, plus the classical Baconian and Cartesian ideological technocratic thesis that natural science is essentially a lordship and mastery, and that's a quotation from Descartes' Discourse on Method, over nature, including inert physical nature, non-human living or animal nature, and human nature alike. The radical nature of the doctrine of natural piety is also perfectly captured, I think, by Wittgenstein's dark, edgy thoughts, which I've already quoted, the ones about the limits of science, and which I'll just read that sentence again. The age of science and technology is the beginning of the end of humanity. The idea of great progress is a delusion, along with the idea that the truth will ultimately be known, and that there is nothing good or desirable about scientific knowledge, and mankind in seeking it is falling into a trap. Obviously, by scientific knowledge there, I mean scientific knowledge that is in the grip of scientific naturalism, not all scientific knowledge, because I'm pro-science at the same time as wanting to be a critic of a certain view, a philosophical view of the natural sciences. From Kant's anti-mechanism to Kantian anti-mechanism. It's well known that in the Critique of Pure Reason, the prolegomena to any future metaphysics, and especially the metaphysical foundations of natural science, that Kant is a self-described Newtonian mechanist about the manifest natural space-time world in which, as human animals, we must live, move, and have our being. But as early as 1763, in his pre-critical or Leibnizian Wolffian period, in an essay called The Only Possible Argument in Support of a Demonstration of the Existence of God, Kant explicitly rejected the pre-formationist conception of biological generation and embryogenesis, according to which creatures pre-exist in their basic forms or structures and require only the mechanical addition of bulk in order to develop. Instead, he developed the epigenetic view, whereby the basic forms or structures of creatures themselves are emergently generated by the spontaneous but also rule-governed operations of a goal-oriented or teleological vital source of some kind. And in that essay, he even went so far as to assert that it would be absurd to regard the initial generation of a plant or animal as a mechanical effect incidentally arising from the universal laws of nature. So even at that time in his career, he was already implicitly an anti-mechanist of some sort. In the Prolegomena, he asserted the identity, or at least the strong continuity of mind and life. And he says, life is the subjective condition of all our possible experience. In the introduction to the metaphysical foundations of natural science, he denied that there could ever be a naturally mechanistic science of psychology. In the second half of the Critique of the Power of Judgment, he not only asserted that, quote, the mind is for itself entirely life, the principle of life itself, unquote, and also that it would be absurd for humans ever to hope that there might yet arise a Newton who could make comprehensible even the generation of a blade of grass according to natural laws. But he also worked out a number of fundamental concepts and methodological themes in the philosophy of biology, including the notion of a living organism, of a self-organizing system, the various distinct kinds of teleology, and the special role of teleological concepts and teleological thinking in the natural sciences. Finally, in the unfinished transition project, in the Opus Posthumum, which Kant was working on when he died, Kant also hypothesized the dual emergence of natural mechanisms in nature and organismic life, including mind, alike from a single ontologically neutral but also non-static material substrate, the dynamic ether. So Kant's commitment, at the very least, Kant's commitment to Newtonian mechanism is somewhat conflicting. Indeed, it is fully arguable that Kant is at bottom an anti-mechanist. This, in turn, is the upshot of a recent book that I like very much by Jennifer Mensch, her recent fascinating philosophical historical study, Kant's Organicism, which, and then I'm going to quote from her, she says, this book starts by tracing the history of the life sciences as Kant would have come to know them, focusing especially on those philosophers and life scientists whose works directly engage Kant during his intellectually formative years. Once Kant's connection to the life sciences has been established, the remainder of the book moves on to an examination of the exact nature of the influence of these sciences on the emerging critical system. When viewed from the perspective of the life sciences in this manner, Kant's theoretical philosophy becomes reframed as a philosophical project whose development was deeply influenced by the rise of organicism, and then by organicism, the thesis of organicism as she's using that term, she means it can be defined by its view of nature as something that cannot be reduced to a set of mechanical operations. And now I'm just going to talk for a little bit and then I'll come back at the bottom of page 5, basically. So what she does in the next part of the book is place Kant's work on anti-mechanism in its historical context, and she ties it to other work that was being done in, roughly speaking, philosophy of the natural sciences in the 18th century. And she shows that Kant was influenced by various writers who were postulating the existence of organisms as beings that have a nature that is different, categorically different and non-reducible to merely mechanical systems. And this was an idea that didn't just emerge fully blown, but it took 100 years for this idea to move forward. And then Kant basically crystallizes this set of thoughts in the second half of the third critique, and then he's continuing to work on it in his post-critical writings. I mean, the third critique is already part of the post-critical tradition, and then was still working on it, at the end of his career. And I also say a few things in this section about how Kant's writing has had a tremendous impact on the German idealist tradition after Kant, Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, and then also had an interesting influence on early 20th century writing of a vitalist, broadly speaking, vitalist sort, namely by Henri Bergson, Creative Evolution and other works, also Samuel Alexander, whom I will quote, also Alfred North Whitehead, who is an extremely interesting early 20th century philosopher, and that Kant's thoughts on this had an impact on that entire tradition. The other thing I do in this section is I distinguish between two different kinds of mechanism, and I don't think Kant drew this distinction quite as clearly as he could, but I'm quite sure that he was aware of it. The first kind I call causal mechanism, and so a system, a dynamic system, a material system, is causally mechanistic if and only if it follows from the general causal laws of nature. So its various properties flow from the general causal laws of nature together with all the settled physical facts about the past. And such systems have certain kinds of mathematical properties that could be computed, as we now would think of it, on an ideal Turing machine or an ideal computer, from the knowledge of the laws of nature, or if we had a full list of the laws of nature, together with full information about the facts about the past. And in particular, a system is causally mechanistic if it obeys and is in fact determined by what we now think of as the conservation laws for matter, i.e. energy. Now, there's another kind of mechanism which Kant was also interested in a Leibnizian context, which we might call purely psychological mechanism, which doesn't necessarily involve material processes. And so if you thought there was an independent soul of some kind or an angelic mind of some kind, but it was following a mechanistic process. This is what Leibniz calls automata spirituale, which is a spiritual automaton. And Leibniz, of course, was interested in the foundations of what we would now think of as computation theory. So there could be processes, mental processes, distinct from physical processes, which would have the same form as a computable algorithm and on a digital computer. And then Kant said, if we had, if our mental lives was structured like this, we would have, and we thought we were free, we would have only the freedom of a turn spin. So the freedom of a kind of wind-up mechanism, which he regarded as not consistent with genuine freedom. So in each case, if something is mechanistic, either if it's materially, causally mechanistic, or it's merely formally mechanistic, it's going to be contradictory to the nature of freedom as Kant understands it. And for Kant, whatever is free is, first, it's mental activity, and because he thinks there's a strong continuity between mental activity and life, it's going to be a living system, and therefore it's going to have the structure of an organism. And it's also going to involve, because it's mental and because it involves choices, and because if it's really free, it's going to be following or trying to follow the categorical imperative, it's going to have moral powers as well. That is to say, it's going to have cognitive powers and non-cognitive powers which are attentive to moral principles. It doesn't mean we always do the right thing, but the idea is that we're at least capable of recognizing the right thing and perhaps acting in accordance with it. Every such system, and of course we are such systems, every such system is non-mechanistic in both the causal mechanical sense and in the formal sense. We're not merely, according to Kant, we're not merely wind-up toys, either at a psychological level or at a Kant's organicism, as Mensch's book so effectively shows, captures Kant's brilliant insight that mechanical principles and facts cannot explain what I've been calling, and describing to you as the organicist phenomena. Include first natural teleology or organismic life, including plants and animals. Second, and this is extremely interesting for Kant, any organism that has a certain kind of conscious capacity whereby it's aware of a difference between its right and left hand sides, or its top and its bottom. And Kant was convinced that something that was characteristic, he'd drawn this from work by Georges Buffon, but he was convinced that one characteristic of life is that it develops in what's called a handed way. That is to say, it's got, not bilateral symmetry, but what's called enantiomorphy, which is where, there are two geometrically identical, kinds of structures that cannot actually be put into the same. They can't be made congruent in a single, space. And Kant thought that this was characteristic of all living systems, that they've got this enantiomorphic or directional structure. So snails, have shells that are curving in one direction, and this could not be made identical with, a set of spirals that were moving in another direction, even though they might have the same qualitative properties point by point. So that also, that inside a global time structure or inside a global space structure, there would be the feeling. Kant was very interested in something he called in the third critique the feeling of life, which is a sense of our own vitality. And he thought that living systems, living conscious beings had that. And it's particularly all the modes of pleasure and pain are, he thinks, aspects of the feeling of life. And therefore human mentality, this is third, including consciousness, intentionality, imagination, conceptualizing, judging, and inferential reasoning, which Kant believed all have phenomenological features, conscious features, experiential features, which contemporary philosophers are now, in the analytic tradition, are now just discovering, as if philosophers hadn't known this for, 200 or 300 years. Human spontaneity, is an organicist phenomenon on this account because of the continuity of mind and life. And source incompatibilist free will, that means where free will starts in a particular agent, and if exactly where the agent was living and trying to carry out choices or actions, there were deterministic processes, or now we would think of merely indeterministic processes, that would be inconsistent with the agents being available there. So if the world, basically, if the Big Bang just flows through you and carries you away, you're not an agent. Why? Because it's a merely mechanical process of some sort, but actually free beings don't organize their life in that way. And then finally, another organicist phenomenon, human non-instrumental, that is to say non-consequentialist, Kant-style deontological normativity or morality, would also be non-mechanistic because it presupposes life, presupposes consciousness, presupposes the feeling of life, presupposes free will and attentiveness. I'm going to skip a few pages and just talk for a second. So what I want to say is that what Kant, there's a sort of a tricky point here which has to do with Kant interpretation, right? So what I've been doing so far is taking Kantian ideas and trying to bring them to a contemporary context. And now, for the benefit of Kant scholars, I have to say a little bit about Kant's own text, because there is some ambiguity in Kant's own defense of these views, which I'll just mention very quickly. And that is that, so when Kant put forward these anti-mechanistic ideas, he tended to shift back and forth between, on the one hand, saying it's that we cannot believe or know organismic systems to be non-mechanical in nature, and then in other texts he's really saying those systems themselves, if they're organisms, are not, like as a matter of reality, they're not themselves mechanistic. And so it tends to shift back and forth between a merely epistemological view, a view about our beliefs and knowledge, and a view that's more fully metaphysical. And Kant scholars still debate whether Kant was committed to the more epistemological approach or the more metaphysical approach. Obviously, I'm taking it in a metaphysical sense, not because I don't think that the texts are ambiguous, but just because it seems philosophically much more interesting to me, and I'm much more interested in how we might develop a contemporary Kantian metaphysics where we take the strong metaphysical approach. And so in Kantian terms, there's a question as to whether the concept of an organism, the concept of life, has a merely what Kant calls a regulative use, which is this hypothetical use for the purposes of knowing or believing, a guide for knowing or believing, or what he calls a constitutive use. And that's the more controversial one, but the constitutive use would mean that the concept actually has application. And so it would be a metaphysical view, and obviously I'm pushing the constitutive use as opposed to the regulative use. I'm also, in contemporary philosophy, so now taking this metaphysical view close to contemporary philosophy, I'm very interested in a recent book by Thomas Nagel, I quoted from it already, called Mind and Cosmos, which, by the way, was extremely controversial in North America. A great many contemporary philosophers, contemporary analytic philosophers particularly, made fun of Nagel, said he was too old, he was getting senile because he didn't understand biology. No, it's a most unbelievable non-argument criticism by ad hominem abuse, basically. Anyway, so I like this book, and it became really, in professional philosophy in North America, it became embarrassing to say that you like this book, because people would sort of go, oh, well, I saw a review of it. They hadn't read it, of course, but I saw a review of it, and they said Nagel is completely wrong about everything. Poor Nagel, he's gotten old, he doesn't understand. Anyway, so Nagel says in this book, so this is now on the, so Nagel says, we can metaphysically postulate what he calls a cosmic predisposition to the formation of life, consciousness, and the value that's inseparable to them. And there are quite a few remarks in his book that are of this sort, and it's also, consistent with this idea that rational intelligibility is at the root of the natural order. And the basic idea there, which I take to be a very Kantian idea, is that we don't assume that the human being and living animals other than humans are somehow in a physically alien universe, and we need now somehow to figure out the connection between a merely inert, fully mechanical universe and then human beings. What we postulate, and this is connected to Kant's theory of transcendental idealism, is that there's a fundamental conformity between the way our minds are and the way that the world is. And so we're not alien, metaphysically we're not alien to the world, and that the world has the real possibility of rational intelligibility, of mindedness, of life, and so on, built into it, even if at various stages in its natural history it hasn't become complex enough to realize or exemplify those properties. But the real possibility of those properties is built into nature. And that, I take it, is a very idealist thought, and all these process philosophers and so on are all saying the same thing, which is we shouldn't think about the physical as alien to the mental, and we shouldn't think about the mental or life as alien to the physical. We should be able to think about a world in which nature includes a fusion, the possibility of a fusion of the mental and the living and the physical, but it's all one universe, it's all one world. There aren't levels where fundamentally physical level, and then somehow metaphysically pops out of the fundamental physical level the light, the living, and then mind somehow pops out of the living, which is all reducible to the physical. That's either a materialist world or a dualist world. That metaphysics, dualism and materialism, are impossible. They're just not acceptable from a Kantian point of view, I think, and from Nagel's now point of view. That kind of metaphysics is impossible. And so to say that we should be looking at a Kantian anti-mechanist position, we're looking at a third alternative to materialism and dualism, whereby mind, life, the physical, they're all part of the same cosmic structure. They're all part of the same metaphysical structure, even though it's not the case that everything is alive, everything is minded. It takes time to develop. So this section is called Natural Piety and the Limits of Natural Science. I'm going to read again from that text. Anti-mechanism in its classical early 20th century guise as British emergentism has its original intellectual roots in Aristotle's De Anima and Aristotle's physics, and in the 17th and 18th century epigenicist, organicist tradition so well described by Jennifer Mensch, when these accounts are combined with late 18th and early 19th century romantic conceptions of nature, expressed, for example, in the seventh of Rousseau's Reveries of a Solitary Walker, Wordsworth's and Percy Shelley's poetry, and their notion, particularly Wordsworth's notion of natural piety, by Mary Shelley's stunning critique of mechanistic, reductive, scientific sins against natural piety in Frankenstein, and by Caspar David Friedrich's and J.M. Turner's nature painting. So there's this whole tradition of a reaction to a mechanistic worldview in romantic poetry and novels and so on, and the notion of natural piety, which I take to be continuous with Kant's writings, is emerging from this tradition. So all or most of these, in turn, have their proximal intellectual sources in Kant's assertions of the cognitive semantic limits of science and scientific knowledge in the Critique of Pure Reason, of anti-mechanism in his moral and political philosophy, and also of a direct epistemic, metaphysical, and moral link via immediate consciousness between what he calls the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me at the end of the Critique of Practical Reason. Taken together with his closely related notions of the beautiful in nature, the sublime, his notion of artistic genius, life, and what he calls purposiveness without a purpose, which is free teleological activity, all in the Critique of the Power of Judgment. Correspondingly, here are some of the most important texts in this natural piety tradition, running from Rousseau and Kant through Wordsworth and the Shelleys to the British emergentist Samuel Alexander. Now, we're already running quite a bit over time, so I won't actually read out these texts, although they're beautiful. I'll read one text, which I love. So I'll read the Wordsworth. Yeah. So this is from a poem by Wordsworth, a very famous poem by Wordsworth. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. And then there are these other texts. Now, one thing that's interesting is that the notion of natural piety in the Romantic poets has been taken in contemporary or recent and contemporary emergentist metaphysics as a way of claiming that there are going to be properties of certain kinds of complex systems that are not reducible to their merely microchemical, microphysical, mechanical properties, and that the attitude that a philosopher must take towards these newly emerging properties is not to try to reduce them to the merely physical, but to allow for a world in which such properties could. I don't even want to do this because it means they're above, but they're not really above. They're new in the system, and they're irreducible to the physical and mechanical properties of the system, and that it's a fundamental turn in our view of nature when we regard nature as having this capacity, and we don't try to explain them in mechanical terms. We resist the temptation to explain them in merely mechanical terms, as if we could turn the living into the non-living, the mental into the merely physical, the free into the determined, and so on, the moral into the merely instrumental. It's a project of reduction whereby we lose what's specifically human and specifically rational about us. That's the natural piety thought. So it's a metaphysical, it's not just a romantic poetry thought, it's also a metaphysical and epistemological doctrine. So, because I'm taking Kant's transcendental idealism to be a real, and in particular an empirically realistic metaphysics of nature, and not merely epistemology, it follows, I think, with synthetic a priori necessity, that space, time, quantity, movement, organismic life and natural teleology, consciousness, feeling and emotion, aesthetic form, including beauty and sublimity, and morality, are all manifestly real. That is to say, they're in the world of appearances. They're given directly to us. They're not hidden behind our experience of the world. They're not noumenal in any way. They're ontologically basic, but in this apparent world, the natural world of human experience. The Kantian, romantic, British emergentist philosophical doctrine of natural piety, as I understand it then, counsels radically agnostic, that is to say, we know that we cannot know anything that hides behind the appearances, empirically realistic and metaphysically sane, aesthetically sensitive, ethically sensitive, natural religious, and also, above all, anti-mechanistic, non-reductive, non-dualist, primitivist approach to investigating nature that, as I said before, is pro-science but not scientistic, so it's not reductive in any way. By virtue of knowing the inherent scope and limits of natural scientific investigation. And so my claim is that we can liberate the natural sciences from their own, materialist ideology by taking this attitude of natural piety. Natural piety, in turn, as a thesis in real metaphysics, and also as an aesthetic, emotional, and natural religious, action-guiding, and above all, life-guiding, respectful and ultimately reverential attitude towards manifest nature, is intended as an essential corrective to the epistemic and metaphysical arrogance, and also to the aesthetic insensitivity and even military industrial authoritarianism of the nominally realistic, reductive, naturally mechanistic epistemology and metaphysics of what the logical empiricists called the scientific conception of the world, and its corresponding deeply exploitative lordship and mastery of nature ideology, fully aligned with global corporate capitalist technocracy, as it has been explicitly or implicitly developed, defended, and disseminated by Francis Bacon, by Descartes, by the Vienna Circle, and I might say by recent and contemporary scientific naturalists. Thus, the real metaphysical thesis and life-guiding, respectful and reverential attitude of natural piety gives a rich sense to the radical poet Muriel Rukeyser's deep insight that the universe is made of stories, not of atoms. Now that may sound crazy to you, but this is what I think she means. The real universe, the one that really matters for rational, but also human, all-too-human creatures like us, is made of minded animals. Those parts of the world that we are the most important parts, especially human persons, and their manifestly real normative stories, that is to say, the narratives of their lives, not a fundamentally physical, life-excluding, mind-excluding, freedom-excluding matter and its noumenal metaphysical atoms, noumenal microphysical atoms. That is, not only in Thomas Nagel's terminology is rational intelligibility at the root of the natural order, such that there is a cosmic predisposition to the formation of life, consciousness, and the value that's inseparable from them, but also our philosophical recognition of these facts puts inherent epistemic, metaphysical, aesthetic, ethical, natural, religious, and even socio-cultural, political, critical limits on the scope of natural science. In short, Kantian natural piety is real metaphysics. It's metaphysics with a human face, but above all it is committed to the primacy of the normative, that is, to the thesis that metaphysics has axiological, that is, to value-based foundations, and it's also committed to direct aesthetic, ethical, natural, religious, and socio-cultural implications that are all, I take it, in direct opposition to the deeply wrong-headed 20th and 21st century conception of metaphysics as supposedly value-free, but actually aesthetically, ethically, anti-religiously, socioculturally, and politically deeply committed via scientism and global corporate capitalism, scientific, quote-unquote, scientific philosophy, and rigorous science. That was the logical empiricist conception, strenge Wissenschaft. As Kant so brilliantly anticipated in the 1780s and 1790s, and as Wittgenstein so rightly, explicitly pointed out in the 1930s, in accepting the reductive, mechanistic, ideological, technocratic, and ultimately Frankensteinian scientific conception of the world, we are falling into a trap. It's the beginning of the end for humanity, and what I'm saying is that we can avoid this death trap only by theoretically adopting, by taking to heart, and then by freely acting according to the real metaphysical, epistemological, aesthetic, ethical, natural, religious, and socio-cultural political doctrine of natural piety. So this is supposed to be not just philosophy of science, it's supposed to be liberationist